Over in the Eurozone, there are new estimates that the amount of money needed to clean up Spain's troubled banking sector will come to about 70 billion euros or roughly 88 billion US dollars.
At the same time, however, the country's 10-year bond yield has hit 7% for the first time since Spain entered the Eurozone. Arirang's Yoo Ji-hae reports.
Spain is preparing to argue before the G20 meeting in Mexico next week that it's bringing its banking crisis under control even as the yield on its sovereign debt has surged to new highs. Sources told Reuters on Thursday that an audit of Spanish banks is expected to show they need only 60 to 70 billion euros, or roughly 75 to 88 billion US dollars, to be rescued. The audit of Spanish banks by two independent consulting firms, Oliver Wyman and Roland Berger, would help reassure investors about Spain's capability to clean up the banking sector and keep its public finances under control. Spain's Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy ordered the deadline for the audit to be advanced, so he will have it in hand when he attends the G20 summit in Mexico held next Monday. The independent assessment was a key condition for the 125 billion US dollar bailout plan agreed on Saturday to shore up Spain's ailing banks. But doubts remain about the bank bailout, with Spain's borrowing costs rising to more than 7% on Thursday, its highest level since the country joined the Eurozone after Moody's Investor Service downgraded the country's debt rating to just above junk status.
I think it does indicate that the ratings agencies are pushing Spain ever closer toward the edge of that cliff.
An earlier report by the International Monetary Fund showed that Spanish banks would need at least 40 billion euros in additional capital to prevent a severe downturn, but it also recommended a large financial cushion on top of that amount. Yoo Ji-hae, Arirang News.
And staying in the Eurozone, with the key elections in Greece just right around the corner this weekend, Greek citizens brace for the uncertainties ahead.
Right, the election is seen by many as a referendum on the euro, as it could determine if Athens stick to painful austerity or crashes out of the Eurozone. Arkani Lee reports.
Fears that Greece will collapse financially and leave the euro have triggered bank runs in Greece over the past few days. Bankers say total daily outflows by depositors from major banks are between 500 to 800 million euros, or about 625 million to a billion US dollars. The uncertainty of what will happen after the elections on Sunday has left many people nervous.
I'm worried, but I don't have money, not to take out nor to put in. But my main worry is not me, it's for my children, because at the moment they don't have a job.
The latest polls show a dead heat between Syriza leftist leader Alexis Tsipras and New Democracy, or pro-bailout party leader Antonis Samaras, who says Greece's future should not be taken lightly.
We cannot play poker or dice with Greece. There is the path of responsibility in which you are clear about what you want, and we say we want the euro and renegotiation of the bailout.
And at his last campaign rally in Athens, the head of Greece's leftist party promised on Thursday to ditch the bailout agreement and to bring changes to the country.
On Monday, the bailout will be history. Monday will be a new era of growth, solidarity. Together, we will begin to change the country.
Meanwhile, stocks surged in international markets on Thursday on a report that major central banks would be ready to pump money into the Greek financial system after the elections. Economists say that because Greece has been in recession for the past 5 years with a jobless rate of over 22%, if bailout funds are cut off, Greece would be even worse off outside the euro. Connie Lee, Arirang News.
And Korea is certainly no stranger to being gripped by a financial crisis and emerging stronger.
Though the 1997 Asian financial crisis and the current Eurozone crisis are different, are there any lessons to be learned from Korea? Professor Phillip Lipscy of the Department of Political Science at Stanford University joins us on the line from Tokyo.
Professor Lipscy, thanks so much for talking to us.
My pleasure.
Well, very briefly, what are the main differences between the Korea crisis in the late 90s and the Eurozone crisis now?
Well, I would say that the principal difference is that in the European case, there's a common currency, the euro, involved, and that makes it a much more difficult situation because in the Asian crisis, a country like Korea could devalue or weaken its currency, and that provided a means of adjusting Korean prices downward. But in the European situation, there's no easy way to accomplish that.
Right, so how tough was the Korean response to the 1997 Asian financial crisis?
I think it's commonly acknowledged that the Korean response to the crisis was very tough. And it was tough primarily because the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, imposed very strict conditions on Korea in order to receive financing. And I think even within the IMF, it's now recognized that perhaps the conditions were somewhat too tough and too focused on structural reform, which was really not the key feature of the Korean crisis.
So was it necessary for housewives to sell their gold, to increase foreign reserves, and people to stop driving to reduce oil imports?
I would say probably not. In the Korean case, really the key feature of the Korean crisis was that Korean banks had borrowed short-term in foreign currency. And they borrowed short-term in foreign currency, but they lent long-term in the domestic market. So the system was unstable in the sense that if there was any disruption in foreign lending, the banks would all of a sudden have difficulty rolling over their borrowing. And this is precisely what happened during the Asian crisis. And so really what Korea needed was a short-term loan to tide over the crisis.
So is there anything that Greece can learn from the Korean example?
You know, I would say with Greece in particular, the lessons from Korea are very limited. And the reason for that is that Greece actually looks like a very traditional developing country crisis where there are deep-seated structural problems, things like corruption, pervasive problems with tax collection, and so forth. So in that sense, it's a very, very different situation from Korea, which really was mostly a short-term liquidity issue. But on the other hand, with countries like Ireland or Italy, I think the lessons from Korea very much apply. In those cases, the domestic structural issues are much less of a factor, and it really is about how do you stabilize the crisis so that contagion is limited from one country to another.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor, for your insight this evening.
My pleasure.
And for another take on whether lessons from Korea's recent experience in a financial crisis can help Europe, we're joined by Professor Junggun Oh from the Department of Economics at Korea University.
Professor Oh, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, you had a first-hand look at Korea's response to the 1997 Asian financial crisis as an economist at the Bank of Korea at the time. What went right for Korea in their response?
I think that at the time, first of all, we had a very severe, very strong and very tight macroeconomic policy. For instance, a very tight monetary policy and fiscal policy. I think at the time, the Bank of Korea raised the core interest rate up to more than 25%. That means a very tight monetary policy. And secondly, we had a very comprehensive restructuring and reforms of the corporate sector and financial sector. At the time, many financial firms were closed, and also the many, even Jebel, we call Jebel, so-called very big conglomerate in Korean business group, were also dismantled. For instance, Daewoo Group, one of the big Jebel, were also dismantled totally. And that was actually Korean experience.
Right. Well, Professor Lipscy said earlier that the structural reforms didn't need to be as harsh as it were, and some experts say that it was really the collective, the efforts by the Korean people that pulled us out of the crisis. What is your take?
Well, I think at the time we thought, and I and my colleagues thought, we had no choice but having restructuring because at the time we had no foreign exchange reserves. So in order to repay our external debt and also to import oil and the natural resources. We have no total natural resources in Korea, very unfortunately. So we need foreign exchange reserves. But on the other hand, at that time, Bank of Korea had only a handful of foreign exchange reserves. That's why we needed to restructure, to reform, to repay our debt, and also to reduce the debt-equity ratio.
So all of this restructuring was important in your view. How much do you think that restructuring plays a role in Greece's situation?
I think that in order to repay our debt, without restructuring, without tighter fiscal policy, how can we repay our debt? Without restructuring and reform, I think Greece also cannot repay their debt. I think recently, as far as I know, Greece had never reformed, restructured anything. So sometimes some people have a skeptics on the Greek attitude, whether they really have a plan to repay or not, because they have not seen anything. You know, in case of Korea at the time, we had a lot of restructuring and reform. Even we sold our core asset. At the time, that's why we made the money to repay our external debt. That's why we recover our crisis very shortly. That's our experience, which Greece must learn from Korea.
So I believe you said that Korea exited the crisis within 2 years.
That's right.
What does Greece have to do in order to fit that timeline, or do you think they'll ever make a timeline?
That's very important one, I think, because you know now Greek people have two choices. One is very comprehensive reform and restructuring, and very quick recovery, as in Korea, and also the very prolonged crisis without reform. So between them, Greek people must have a choice. So what kind of style? I recommend very comprehensive reform, and then a quick recovery is better than. Because compared with the Japan case, Japan at the time, they had not reformed very comprehensively. That's why during the last 20 years, Japan is suffering from the very prolonged stagnation. So maybe considering Korean case and the Japanese case, Greek people must decide which way to choose.
That's a great point. Thank you very much, Professor Oh, for coming in today.
Welcome.